From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Issue 1, Asia Pivot.
A week after his shellacking in the U.S. midterm elections, President Obama has been traveling in Asia. His first stop was the 21-member Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation APEC Summit Forum in Beijing, China. Here, Mr. Obama was able to utilize and reinforce his skill and credentials. The U.S. president used straightforward, if not admonitory, language.
We look to China to create a more level playing field on which foreign companies are treated fairly so that they can compete fairly with Chinese companies. We look to China to become an innovative economy that values the protection of intellectual property rights and rejects cyber theft of trade secrets for commercial gain.
President Obama also announced that visas for Chinese citizens to travel to the United States will be extended on a reciprocal basis from 1 to 10 years. According to the White House, this reform means that 7 years from now, China trade will then have contributed nearly $85 billion a year to the American domestic economy and have supported up to 440,000 U.S. jobs.
Question, what did President Obama achieve or not achieve at the APEC Summit in China? Pat Buchanan.
Little or nothing. This was a huge triumph for the Chinese, John. You got $85 billion in American exports to China. They run a $300 billion surplus at our expense every year. They got $4 trillion in foreign currency reserves. They're building a greater Asia co-prosperity sphere. I mean, like Napoleon tried to do in Europe. They're trying to bring all those countries under their control. They use their investment and aid to get tangible and hard gains for them. The Chinese are really doing to the United States in this century and at the end of the last century what the United States did to Great Britain at the end of the 19th century. We're basically eclipsing them and moving them out as the first military and economic power on earth.
Well,
Pat doesn't like trade, he doesn't like globalization, so you've got to put what he said in perspective. I think that the Chinese are lowering the tariffs significantly on technology, which will be great for U.S. manufacturers. But the important thing that emerged from this meeting was the deal on climate. And it is significant that the 2 biggest emitters of greenhouse gases are basically acknowledging the reality that this is a serious issue. It's an existential issue, if you will, for the planet. They both made promises, and it's true that both of them are set on these trajectories towards the commitments that they made already. But neither leader will be able to walk back on these commitments. The President Obama has already made a number of executive actions. There will be more on coal, and the next president, even if it's a Republican, is not going to come in and say, let's go back to polluting more. And the Chinese are serious about this because nobody wants to breathe the air that comes out of the tailpipe of a car, and that's what the air in Beijing is like. And if you watch the Beijing Marathon recently, people were running with masks. They were actually ventilators. It's the only way you could breathe. So this is a significant step. Most presidents come back from China in recent years empty-handed, and President Obama was invited to the compound, which is the president's residence. The last president to be invited there was Richard Nixon, who made the first real opening with China.
Tom Rogan.
Yeah, I think a couple of things stand out. I think it's a positive step that the president has been able to negotiate this visa extension. You know, China, there are a lot of wealthy individuals in China who can potentially invest in the United States. Hopefully we'll see more of that. But the concern is the broader rule of law in China. I mean, the president rightly mentions the issue with cybercrime on the part of the Chinese government. My concern, though, is that with this climate deal that really doesn't have any impetus for the Chinese actually to do anything in the short term. It's quite vague, deliberately so in the language. And because there are no ramifications for China's continued stealing, essentially, of American proprietary and intellectual rights, that the relationship is still one-sided towards the Chinese and doesn't actually do enough to benefit American interests.
What?
Well, I think, by and large, I think that's true, but I think this is going to be a relationship that's going to evolve over time. I actually thought that this was a very constructive step forward. It's not going to solve all of the problems. It's just too complicated. particularly with a country like China, which has a very different political system. Nevertheless, I think they were moved and moving in the right direction, and I think this is another step on a long-term process that I think is always welcome, rather than it turning into something that is just hostile and
right. And the White House really worked. The White House really worked this with private correspondence between the two presidents. The visit in sunny lands. President Obama, for all the criticism he's taken for not being engaged and not forging personal relationships, he's done this with this Chinese leader, and it's paying off.
China sees itself as the Middle Kingdom. They are deeply economically nationalist. The United States believes in this gauzy New World Order, globalization, you're right, globalism, what's best for the globe. They believe in what's best for number one, just as the Americans once did, and the British did before us, and the Germans did under Bismarck. What we are seeing is, you've seen the massive deindustrialization of the United States. Where do you think all those factories have gone?
Okay, the other side of the coin.
China has plans of its own to challenge U.S. influence in Asia. President Xi persuaded APEC leaders to adopt his free trade area of the Asia-Pacific Agreement, and at the same time announcing major new spending which will boost China's regional influence.
China will commit $40 billion to the establishment of a Silk Road Fund to provide investment and financing support for countries along the Belt and Road to undertake relevant projects in infrastructure, resources development, and industrial cooperation.
Question: what will be the upshot of President Xi's regional economic proposal? Tom.
I think what's happening here is that the Chinese are trying to exert their regional influence in a much bigger way. This investment, the more open tone in terms of APEC, trying to be a bit more conciliatory, at least in terms of the style. But the issue is that the Chinese have a real problem in the sense of the rule of law. I mean, if you think about what's happening in the populist movements in the Philippines and Vietnam, concern about China's role in the East China Sea and encroaching into territory, the United States has an opportunity, if we're willing to be bold, to actually buffer against China in that rule of law area, which often gets, undercovered. But the question is, that needs credibility, and the question is, who has the greater resolve?
This was a charm offensive, there's no doubt, as opposed to, threatening the Vietnamese, threatening the Philippines, threatening the Indians, threatening the Japanese. But at the same time, John, ask yourself, where did they get $40 billion to hand out in foreign aid? They're using that to tie these countries together. They get it from the enormous exports to the United States of America. These mammoth trade deficits we've been running year in and year out. Nobody talks about them.
No, it was talked about very much at the summit, which is why, if you get the lowering of tariffs on the kind of products we make, that we can get over there. You're arguing about battles that have already been lost. Christmas morning, when people open up the gifts under the tree, every one of them has been made in China. We've lost that fight.
Well,
so where is the next generation of jobs going to come from? It's going to come from opening markets in China, which is a huge market.
And you think they're going to let us invade their market the way they've invaded ours? Are you kidding?
They just lowered their tariffs on technology projects. You've got to start somewhere. The Chinese economy is slowing. Obama really had a bit of an upper hand in this meeting.
Okay, things that go bump in the night.
In August, the Pentagon warned that a Chinese fighter aircraft jet had flown dangerously close to a U.S. P-8 military plane off the coast of China. Later this year, China is expanding its nuclear submarine fleet to include attack submarines armed with JL-2 nuclear missiles. With a range of nearly 5,000 miles, these nuclear warheads are capable of striking the United States from East Asia. Because of this rising potential for a military miscalculation at sea or in the air, the U.S. and China signed defense protocols this week to minimize the chances for a dangerous encounter through better coordination about maneuvers, advance notice, and military-to-military communication.
Question: is this perhaps the most important achievement of the summit? Mort Zuckerman.
Well, it certainly is an important achievement. Look, I have to say I disagree with Pat's analysis.
Well, I think all of us do, don't we?
Well, at this point, not always. But, I think China is an emerging country and an emerging power. I don't think they're intending to be just a military power, although they're going to, because of their ideology, they're going to protect themselves. But they are great business people, great traders, always have been. This is a part of their culture, and we're going to have to make place for them, okay? And we should make a place for them.
This was a good agreement, I think. But the thing is, John, they have not reneged on their claim that the South China Sea is their territorial waters and the East China Sea is their territorial waters, and they're moving their navy into the Indian Ocean. I'd say they've got a ways to go, but if you take a look at the trajectory of the United States in the last 20 years and the trajectory of China, there is no doubt which way the world is going.
Well, they have not reneged on their claim on Taiwan either, but they put things kind of on the back burner, and I think that the temperature has been greatly lowered about the fight with Japan in the China Sea.
Does China's nuclear submarine fleet make such an agreement an urgent need?
I think it does. I also think that the issue here broadly, whether it's economic or security, is that the Chinese tend to see, because of their political culture, these oral agreements in a very different way to we do. It's more, I think our leadership, the president, whoever party it comes from, he comes from or she comes from, sees it as a fundamental thing you have to agree with, whether it's the Chinese see it as something that is a bit more flexible in their point of view. And the nuclear submarine issue is a primary concern because of the threat they pose to U.S. aircraft carriers. I mean, one hit, you've got potentially 5,000 dead Americans, but also because the way they are encroaching in the East China Sea, and that does require on our part military buffering, but it also requires a posture that says to the Chinese, you cannot do what you are doing in terms of the threats to our personnel, because there will be repercussions.
But these
What are the repercussions?
Well, I think if the Chinese are threatening a plane, then we lock onto them.
Look,
we potentially take them out.
This is a new Chinese president, President Xi, and new leaders around him, and I think the way they conducted this summit and what they're doing signals that they're going to do business differently. You may say that they're going to walk away from this or that. Actually, if they make a commitment, they can carry it through. They don't have to steer around a Mitch McConnell or a...
Hold on, Pat. Is there a growing sense among U.S. policymakers that China is preparing for war with America?
Look, China has studied closely what happened between Germany and Britain when Germany was the rising power before World War I and Britain, who handled it badly and destroyed each other. They know that. I think they're going to move with toughness and caution. But I think this Xi Jinping is one of the most impressive leaders.
That's right. They're not looking for war.
Here's my notation on that. According to Michael Pillsbury, writing in the current issue of Foreign Policy, many Pentagon planners believe China is preparing for war. Even Henry Kissinger, ever the optimist about China, warns in his latest tome that the U.S. and China could be headed for a, quote, World War I scale, unquote, fight with millions of casualties. What about that?
I talked to Henry about China just the day before yesterday. And Henry was talking just some of the things I'm saying now about China as a middle kingdom. You got to understand, they see things entirely different than we do. I think there's a real danger of a clash, but I don't believe the Chinese want a war with the United States. Or in the United States, we certainly don't. And it's in neither of our interests, but there's no doubt they are growing and building and rising.
And what about all these submarines they have?
We have to deter them.
I mean, that'll check
we have to deter them. I mean, the Chinese will get away with, if they think they can get away with being tough, they will. That's in their interest. The political culture is communist authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think
but there is an opportunity.
We don't need to be so paranoid. If you're going to be paranoid about war with China, look at cyber attacks. I mean, I think that's a place where people are vulnerable.
Guarded.
I wouldn't look for their submarines coming up on our shores.